Introduction to the U.S. Census, a Genealogy Perspective. This is another JDW Talks. My targeted audience are census researchers, genealogists, historians, students. I have a handout for this talk, and there it is. That's the address to a Dropbox account. A little bit about me. I have a small pocket website. This was recorded in late May of 2020. I will have 6 census talks on YouTube. This introduction one, the last time I gave it publicly was at a Daughters of American Revolution talk in San Francisco. I've added material. I never give the same talk twice. And I'm doing this without a script as I go through it. Who uses the U.S. Census? Lots of people use it. But probably the number one group are genealogists, people who do family history. And that's what this is for. For the DAR people, it's a lineage society. They have to prove that they go back in time to some person in the Revolutionary War. So they may not be necessarily genealogists, but they certainly need to know about census work, etc. So I told them some warnings, that group, Census Caveats, that you don't know who gave the family's information. It could have been anybody. You don't know if that person or the census taker was honest and truthful. You don't know if the census taker heard the answers accurately or wrote them down as dictated. You don't know if the answer sheet is an original taken in the field or a correct copy. They may have copied it. Their penmanship looks perfect on some of these sheets, and you wonder whether they got all the information accurately. So the take-home message that I was trying to give is that census records don't prove anything. They only suggest things to research and further document. So the topics I want to cover here are why a census, census milestones, we'll do a history of the census, the reliability of the census, and then at the end, how to look up people on census sheets. And within those major topics, as you can see here on this slide, we'll do definitions and dates and milestones. We'll look at originals or copies, a state census, and how enumerators were picked. In terms of reliability, we'll look at overcounts and undercounts, and then how to look up people. We'll do name searches and location searches. So let's start off, as I usually do, to make sure everybody's on the same page, about definitions. And we'll use this 1940 Rockwell cover of the 1940 census enumeration. Census is a count, a human count. The enumerator is the person taking the count. And that term actually starts in 1880, but I've often used it for before that year. The enumeration is taking the count, and the schedules are what we want to see. That's what the enumerator writes on the sheet as a response to the questions he or she asks. The United States Constitution in 1787 required that an enumeration be taken in the United States every 10 years in such manner as they shall by law direct. So Congress sets up the parameters of the census. The questions may change from one census year, one decennial census year to another. And it may mirror the social and economic conditions of the time. The present censuses are not released to the public until 72 years later. That precedent was set in 1942, and I have a full PowerPoint talk on the origin of the 72-year rule. It has nothing to do with life expectancy. The census day, the day that if you were alive you would be counted, does change over the various census years and the amount of time spent gathering the information. If you look at 1840, it took him 18 months to complete the census, while modern censuses take 1 month in rural areas and 2 weeks in urban areas to complete. The 1900 census was taken on June 1st, and that's a favorite of people, the 1900 census, because when it asks for when you were born, it also asks for a month as well. That's our favorite. The use of the census was to reapportion the House of Representatives, and since 1913, 435 seats are set, and therefore there's this pie that one divides up the seats by populations that were gotten on the census. To give you an example of that, I have a letter in my collection from the House of Representatives from Vermont, and the letter is directed to the new census enumerators that's going to do the 1930 census. It's dated March 29th, 1930. And this is what he says. House of Representatives. It says to these enumerators, it seems to me that unusual pains should be taken to secure this year a careful and complete census, especially in view of the fact that the last census was taken in the winter when it was difficult to reach those in remote sections, with consequent criticism that the figures for Vermont did not represent the full population to which it should be credited. Let us all see to it that there is no excuse for complaint that this census is not complete to the last person. Well, it's obvious he knew what was going to happen. If we look at Wikipedia about the 1930 census, it says that Vermont has been represented in the U.S. House of Representatives by a single at-large congressional district since the 1930 census, when the state lost its second seat, obsoleting its first and second congressional districts. He was in one of those districts. Actually, eventually he became a senator for the state of Vermont. So, populations counts have consequences. And that's why I say that the U.S. Census is a disruptive process, and it always has been. Always controversies about the U.S. Census. The census is also used to distribute federal funds. And this article I found from 2017 found that 132 federal programs use Census Bureau data to distribute more than $675 billion in funds. So everybody, every person who is missed on the census in a location costs that location federal funds. It's not a minor problem. Now, we're going to go through a timeline of the census, but it's not a timeline that if you were doing research you would do. And I warned my audience that the National Archives website says that what you need to do when you do genealogy is to, quote, begin with the most current census year available and work backwards. And today in 2020, that would be the 1940 census. We look forward to the 1950 census in April of 2022. With the 72-year restriction on access to the census, as it emphasizes, the most current year available is 1940. So we start with the first census in 1790. It was an act that was provided to number the inhabitants of the United States. And it was a pretty primitive census, pretty primitive. It was family-based. The senators recommended marshals, assistant marshals, to carry it out. And there was a debate about what would be asked. James Madison was involved in running that and setting it up. He wanted some age groups, and 2 were added. And he also wanted occupations to be asked, and that was denied. The senators said, no, people have multiple occupations, one in summer, one in winter. It wouldn't make sense. They were also worried that the census would be looked on as an intrusion of the new government. It wasn't that far from the Revolutionary War. And a quote that I really like is that the extra data of those questions would be useful only for idle people to make a book. And obviously, genealogists and sociologists, economics people would all disagree with that statement. I'm going to use this drawing to illustrate some aspects of it. This is from Harper's Magazine in 1870, showing a counter and an enumerator. And so from 1790 to 1840, over that period of time, the only names you will see on the census sheets are the heads of family. The other members are just tally marks, just statistics in terms of that. And so people who work with DAR lineages have real problems here. There are suggestions here about that you have the right family, but the only ones you see are the names of the head of family. For the DAR talk, I got some DAR applications. They were being sold online at an auction place. They were from the Pennsylvania Towanda chapter, the George Clymer chapter, that is no longer in existence. And so I used them to illustrate census history. George Clymer was a Declaration of Independence signer and a framer of the Constitution. We'll look at one of his records. And then Samuel Gore was a sergeant during the Revolutionary War. So from this lineage application, I find out that George Clymer died in Morrisville, Pennsylvania in 1813. So he should be on the 1810 census. And here's the 1810 census. You can see it's the borough of Morrisville, and there's George Clymer. And it illustrates that he's the head of the family. You can look up and down, and you'll see numbers there. At this time, there were various age groups, males on the left, females on the right. Now, some other things you should notice is that the census taker made his own form. There were no official forms at that time. And so there may be variation between one of these schedules and someone else's. A pretty primitive system, pretty primitive. The first printed forms were supplied to these marshals, these census takers, in 1830, and the first uniform instructions even were given to them in 1850. So it took a while to get this federal census up to speed. In 1840, the census schedule has a column which asks if you are a pensioner for revolutionary or military service, put your name down there. And for lineage groups like DAR, that's really, really an important column. The federal government actually published in, I don't know, I don't know the copyright there, but it was not too far after that census was taken in 1840, a list of pensioners. That is actually available online, and it's also, I think, in the handbook, the handouts that I gave. So you can look that up. I also bought a book that has the same information, but it has an index in the back, which was very convenient. And so here we have a patriot, Samuel Gore, who died in Sheshkawin, Pennsylvania. And if we look down here, we have his wife, Sarah, and she died in 1845. So there was a good chance that Sarah would have a pension. So I looked at my book, and I find out in Sheshkawin, I'm probably mispronouncing that, a Sarah Gore, about the right age. If I actually look at the census sheet, and these are microfilmed and available online to search, I see her. There she is, Sarah Gore, and the date, her age there, and what I know from the application tends to match. Now you have to be careful here, because it may be that the application date came from the census. In other words, they're not independent figures. And if you can get a pension file, the genealogists love pension files because there's quite a bit of information there. The person has to establish their birth, they have to establish their marriage, they have to establish their ties, etc. in pension files. In 1850, all names are up here on the household, and I have an asterisk there because that's not quite true. So here we have taking the census in 1850. Person has an audience taking the information down. Now, as you can see, I teach from examples, and I'm going to use one DAR application that I found on somebody called Bernice McGill McPherson, and I'll show you, we'll check her listings from here on. Although she's not in the 1850s, she wasn't born yet. Her patriot is Rudolph Fox, a Revolutionary War soldier. And here's her application. She spells it Bernice with an E in the middle of the name, which is interesting. I see her parents there is Hiram and Emily. And here's the 1850 census. So this is the first one that most people's name in the family will show. Again, I have an asterisk. It tells you their ages, it tells you their profession, it tells you where they were born. And if we look at this closely, here is Bernice's family of Hiram and Emily. They had a number of kids at that time. On the bottom left, Bernice is not there. She has not been born yet. Now, the reason I say almost all the people in that family, that location, is because during the 1850 and 1860s, if one had slaves, the slaves had a census, but their names were not there. Their owners were shown. So until the 1870 census, not everybody's name was recorded that lived in the United States. So let's look at the 1860 census for our target family. And there's kind of an interesting problem here. This is Bernice's father, Hiram. He's at the bottom of the page, so we're going to have to look at the next page to complete the family, and there it is. And we're looking down and we see, well, that's strange. We see somebody who's female who's 7 years old. And in 1870, a Bernice who's 17 will appear in the 1870 census. So if you were looking for Bernice and specifically for that spelling of that name, you would be puzzled, and it has to be her. Maybe it's a nickname or something else. But there she is on the 1860 census. In 1870, there is Bernice. She is 17 years of age. And we have a column now called parentage of not only where you were born, but where your parents may have been born. But this is of people born not in the United States. It's just a check mark. So people, you can see people are asking more and more questions. They're asking social questions, questions about whether you are blind or insane, questions about education, and more questions are asked as people are interested in these social statistics. Now, you should know something if you're doing research about this period of time between 1850, 1860, 1870 as to the census schedules that you'll be working with. The original census went to the county courthouse, and they made copies to the state and federal government. So the microfilm copies that you see of Federal Census 1850, 1860, 1870 are copies. They are not originals. And copies always have problems. Where are these originals? Well, I can tell you where two of them are. Cecil B. DeMille was a famous movie director, and in 1915, he was filming in San Fernando Valley and saw someone burning trash. He went over to that house and saw a folded group of papers. Looked interesting. So he asked if he could have them, and the person said, sure, they're just trash. And it turned out that that was the original census forms of Los Angeles City and County. And eventually those ended up at the Southwest Museum. So a lot of them were just thrown away. The second example I have is my own part of my collection. Here I am holding an original 1870 census form. It's actually a mortality schedule from East Boston. The person who was selling it online at an auction site, and it wasn't very much money, indicated that he had gotten a bunch of these at a swap meet or flea market, something like that, and was selling them online. And I believe that it is an original. It is not a copy, and I'll show you why. Do I have an original or do I have a state copy? Well, this is the mortality schedule on the top. This is what you would see if you looked at the microfilm of this page. And this is my bottom of the same sheet. And you can see that there's a lot more information here. That this particular person, known as King Bila, died from a bursting steam pipe on the ship American Eagle, etc., etc., etc. And the person who made the copy just omitted that. I think pretty sure that I have a copy. No, I'm sorry, I have the original. Thinking about the next slide. So on the left, we're going to see what's on my original. On the right is how it was transcribed by a subscription service. And the federal copy of it as well. So here we have on the left Whitten, Florence. I think you can see that. The transcription, the copy, looks like it even could be Whitten, Florence, A. And that's what the transcriber in Ancestry decided it was. The second one, it looks like it's Metcalf, Gertrude S. Looks like an I. The copy, I don't know how you would interpret that. It's crazy. And it comes out as Melcag on the index. And then Lawton Elijah J. Elijah with a Z. A young child who died. This is the mortality schedule. We don't know what that third letter is on the last name, and the Z becomes an S, the W becomes an N on the index. So there's a warning there that when you look at indexes, you need to relax your assumptions. You need to do some variations of names. We'll talk about that at the end. There are state census records as well that you should not ignore, and I'm going to show you one of them. I have a full talk I will have. This is the fifth census talk I'm doing. The sixth one will be on the censuses of New York City. And I found on an auction site, I learn a lot from auction sites, a bunch of papers from a census taker from a community in New York State. These are 1875. It's incredible the amount of information about not only people, but their community that's on this form. This is a working copy that the enumerators, actually weren't enumerators then, but the census takers were given on this 1875 census. Things like facts about the town, newspapers that are there, marriages during the year, deaths during the year, industry other than agriculture, who is working it, number of seats in churches and places of worship. Crazy. Newspapers and other periodicals, domestic animals, remarks on the harvest of 1874. So see if your state has, that of interest, has these state censuses. Goes on and on and on. Here's a very fancy certificate that this person was given. Agricultural statistics. So I went on Family Search, which has filmed these 1875 New York State Census pages. Guess what? They don't have Trenton, New York. I have Trenton, New York. And in fact, clicked too fast there, but in fact, I wrote to the historian there, and my material is the only material that is in existence on the 1875 census for that community, and I digitized it and I sent them that information. Okay, so let's look at the 1880 census. This is an important one. It does have everybody in the family. It's going to have where not only where you were born, but where your parents were born as well. Here's Bernice. She's now married. We look now to see that she was born in Pennsylvania. Her parents were born in Pennsylvania. In fact, this is the same Towanda borough. As you'll see, this person did not move very much. 1880 was a completely different sort of beast. Assistant marshals no longer did the census. Instead, that there was a trained group of people who did it. They were given cards that every day they would have to report how many people that they had enumerated. This is from my collection as well. In 1890, there was a real problem, not with the census, but later, because the census was stored in the Commerce Building, and a fire of unknown origin broke out. And in order to extinguish it, they used a large amount of water. The date of this article is 1921. And they couldn't figure out how to conserve it. They might have been able to do that today with our technology. And they just let it rot and finally took it to a dump. So we only have fragments of 1890. Let me turn my attention to who's taking the census. No, it's no longer assistant marshals. And Director Miriam has this interview, and he says, while the impression has gone abroad that the census is to be a refuge for incompetence, the truth and the actual facts are that all applicants will be subjected to examination before appointment, which will be as rigid as the examinations before the Civil Service Commission. Well, maybe. So as part of my collection, I have here an application for appointment for the 1900 census. And this person by the name of Grayson has wonderful handwriting. He wants to be a copyist. The states were allowed to get a copy of the census from 1890 on if they paid for it. And unfortunately, most of them did not. That's why, if they had paid for it, we'd have the 1890 census, even though the federal ones were destroyed. He fills it out. He's a citizen. He's an outstanding citizen. He has two people who sponsor him. Looks great, right? No. Doesn't get it. I return your application with the information that it will not be received for filing unless accompanied by the request of a senator or representative in accordance with the foregoing statement. After such recommendations are received by this office, the person so recommended will be given a practical examination to determine their fitness for the work. I don't think this person ever got the job, and copyists weren't, in great demand. So here's 1900. We have a personal description, and you can see now that the month and year date of birth is shown, which is really kind of neat. The number of births you've had and the number who are still alive are there. Lots of things. And here is Bernice. We find out she's born in July. We find out she's had 3 children and only one is alive. Things were pretty rough in those days. And she's born in Pennsylvania. Her parents are born in Pennsylvania. In 1902, the Census Bureau was established so that for the first time from year to year, they had a professional staff. Before that, every time there was a decennial census, they started anew in terms of the people who ran it. Here's the 1910 census. I have some information about how they trained and got enumerators. And here is Bernice there. She's still in Pennsylvania. So in 1910, they started competitive exams for enumerators. You were given a narrative that said, you began your work on this day at Walnut Street. and blah blah blah, and the people who were there were so and so, and you had to fill in a blank schedule, and then you were evaluated. So William Conlon of Owego, Tioga County, New York, took this exam on February 5th, 1910. I didn't do too well. Interesting, the test is from Fresno County, California. That's the narrative. Well, do we want to give this person a job or not? Sure, he passed. He's eligible. We'll take him. And so the notice to him says, hey, you know, these are all the cautions. This is all your responsibility. This is what you should have written. Here's your badge. And there's the sheet of William Conlon, one of his sheets. And I look at this sheet and I think to myself, no, that's too good. What he did was he copied. Must have been scared from his what he did on the test things. He obviously copied this from what he had done in the field. And so, you know, did he really get everything correct or not? Now I want to turn to a topic called overcounts and undercounts. Overcounts, you don't expect overcounts, really. Tacoma in 1910 had 116,000 people. In 1900, they only had 37,000. Wow, what happened? Well, it was so suspicious they did a second enumeration and they found 82,000 plus people. And when they looked at it closely, they found out it was fraudulent. Frauds in census of cities discovered. And remember, this is the census gives you money from the federal government per person. It gives you representation. It's important. And there may be a attempt to finagle the data. And so when the people looked at the census sheets, you can look at this from Tacoma, Washington, and look at it closely. The person put down, that's a vacant lot. All those people that are listed, they don't exist. There's another vacant lot. People didn't exist. And it's an interesting story, the Tacoma problem. The one that I like the best here of an overcount is in San Francisco in 1920. We're going to talk about Benjamin Alleman. Benjamin is on the San Francisco sheet that we'll look at. The census day was January 1st. And this enumerator, Josephine Ertola, on the 4th and 5th visited a place. And remember, the rules are if you're alive on January 1st, you should be in the census. Okay? And so here we have a whole bunch of people. When you see people like that, they're usually in a convent or a hospital, some sort of institution. And so she records Benjamin Alleman and all these other people as well. And where are we? He's head of the family. Well, it turns out there were bodies in the morgue. She went to the morgue and got the people who were alive on January 1st. In the meantime, in another part of San Francisco, Benjamin Alleman appears with a cross next to his name. And on his line, it says he passed away on January 1st, 1920. So he's double counted. And this enterprising enumerator went to the morgue. Here's the obituary of, or at least the listing of the burial of Benjamin. And it says funeral services will be held tomorrow, Saturday, at 2 p.m. This is from January 2nd. So he was buried on January 3rd, and the enumerator went there, and his body wasn't there. In effect, she just took a bunch of cards and was being paid, by the way, by the number of persons counted. So in 1920, getting back to Bernice, we have a problem here. Here's Bernice. Everything looks fine. All the times. Born in Pennsylvania. No. Her father is now born in New York. So again, DAR people, if you're using this, you can't use this as a fact. You have to supply some real documents here. 1930, getting more to the modern sort of census forms that I'm used to. And it turns out I had trouble finding Bernice. Her son was in Boston. And it turns out it looks like from the schedule, let's see if I have something to point out where she is on here. She's the second line from the bottom. She's living in a situation where it looks like there are a number of people who are boarding. It may be some sort of aged home here that she is in. Yeah, so there she is there. And this is not in Pennsylvania. This is in, I think it's in Massachusetts. Undercounts are a lot more serious. These are people who were missed on the count. The number of reasons why. Movement, they refused to participate. There are inaccurate enumerator maps. Large cities are difficult to enumerate, and so are rural areas. Lots of problems there, and of course there's human error. For instance, here is a description of the census districts in Illinois, and if you didn't know this and knew that somebody was living in this census district and couldn't find them, you would wonder why. And the reason that you can't find them is an asterisk there, and through a misinterpretation of the boundaries of his district, the notes say on this page, an enumerator in Granite City failed to canvass 4 squares containing, according to a local census, about 600 people, missed 600 people. No correction of the population can be made, as the error was not discovered until after the population of the United States had been announced. So sometimes these definitions pages have a lot more information to solve mysteries. Here is a table of undercounts, and you'll see that until, it got lower and lower, but they made a concerted effort to try and get everybody. On the 1940 census, the last one that's open, 1 out of 20 people were missed. In 1950, it's assumed about 1 out of 25. And they did post surveys and other ways of figuring this out. In 1940, they had a draft and they looked at the people on the draft, which had penalties if you didn't register, and people on the census to figure out what the discrepancies were. In 1934, the National Archives was established. They're the agency that will release the censuses. 1940, I'm not going to discuss in detail. I have a full YouTube talk on this. I will tell you in 1940, however, that sampling started. Here's a sampler for you. Sampling meant that a small portion of the population asked additional questions, and it got to be more and more sampling. I'm not going to talk about the upcoming release of the 1950 census because that also I did a full talk on. In 1970, there was a mail-out, mail-back census for the first time. And today, in 2020, most of the questions that are asked by the Census Bureau on something called the American Community Survey. A small percentage of us every year gets this survey. It's a large number of pages. And so a number of the questions that usually were asked in the Federal Census are now asked in this community survey. Okay, let's finish this talk by talking about how to find people on censuses that are public. Obviously a great way of doing that would be a name index. Name indexes are efficient ways of finding people. You don't have to know much about the census format. You can go directly to the right page of the image, and a number of websites have name indexes. Some of them are subscription services. The 1940 census has a free index on family search. However, there may be problems. Look at it from the census taker's point of view. Unusual sounding names, false names, abbreviated names, bad penmanship, name entry mistakes, all of these will influence name indexes. And the people who transcribe them, they may have poor quality images, ripped, taped, faint writing, and they're doing this from microfilm, interpreting handwriting. Some of these projects were exported to other countries. English was not the primary language. And write what you see format may create some funny things. So for instance, here's the 1910 census for Pennsylvania. We have the Donato family on the index. And then suddenly we see somebody called Wachnatenaget Donato. Well, it must be some strange family name. I mean, how many people do you know that are called Wachnatenaget? So let's take a look at it. All right, here's the Donato family. And this is what the transcribers saw. Wachnatenaget. No, that's not christened yet. Here's an example where the census taker made a mistake. And instead of putting last name first, the person put down first name last. And it's obvious, like Robert Curley, that mistake was done. But the person doing the transcription was told to write what you see, and they reversed the name. I mean, what they did was they did accurate to their instructions. It's not accurate to the name. So I would suggest if you do name searches that you know something about wildcards, how to fill in letters, how to make things more variable, that you can search for children, you can search on first name, and as I've been emphasizing, you need to relax your assumptions and not really expect to see things perfectly on any of these forms. The other way of searching people is by location. And if there isn't a name index when a census first comes out publicly, sometimes name indexes fail for some of the reasons I just gave. If you can't find somebody on the census, you can try different variations of the name, but they may not be there at all. And location searches will show you that the residence was missed. In large cities, it might be faster to find John Smith by address than by index. People were interested in the residents that lived in their house before. They don't know their name. Locate them by address. And then there's a whole bunch of research that's dependent on neighborhoods, but not the people necessarily, the specific people there, and location searches are important for them. And I'll tell you that the website that I'm associated with has the largest number of locational tools than anyone on the internet. It's at stevemorse.org, not .com, who is a professional musician. stevemorse.org. There are about 300 free utilities there. The census section, Steve and I are partners on since the early 2000s, when we were working to produce a locational tool for the 1930 census. And so both of us and our many volunteers have provided free to you locational tools. You can see we have finders for all of those years, especially the large cities. But in 1950, that's coming up, we will have tools for over 2,400 cities, urban areas, and lots of rural communities. Now, I have on YouTube a full talk on these census location search tools using the 1950 census, and it's going to become crucial for you to successfully research that census if you understand what tools are available. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction to the census, a genealogy perspective. This has been another talk on JDW Talks. As you can see here, I have in the yellow 5 talks now, census talks online, once this one becomes put in there. And I have one more to go. Then I have some talks on Ellis Island. And I have talks on natural history. They are already there, 3 of them, including a virtual field trip to the Headlands community of California, Dana Point, California. So if you enjoyed this talk and enjoyed the others, spread the word. Thank you. Have a good day.